big welcome to everyone in Oxford and to everyone else online to today's seminar measuring multi-dimensional well-being. This is organized by OFI at Oxford and IAP at George Washington University. I'm James Foster in Washington, D.C., here at the Elliott School of International Affairs, just a few blocks from the White House and the White House reconstruction site. Today, we are pleased to have Dr. Putu Natih of the Faculty of Economics and Business, Universitas Indonesia, here with us to present her paper, Beyond Poverty, Mapping Multidimensional Wellbeing in Indonesia, which constructs a well-being index based on the counting method, having both material and non-material dimensions. This is very much unlike dashboards or composite indicators. The counting method produces a policy-friendly index built upon cutoffs that can be viewed as intuitive targets or goals in each dimension and across dimensions. The overall headline level in a country is readily decomposed by population subgroup, and the contribution of a dimension to overall well-being is also easily calculated, greatly facilitating policy analysis and action. Am I right in my characterization, Sabina? Excellent. Last week, Jacob Dirksen constructed such a measure using unique data set in the US. And next week, I believe Rizwan Al-Haq will be in Oxford to present a paper proposing a gross well-being index, evidence from Chad, Comoros, and Iraq. But now it's time to hear about Indonesia. So without further ado, I turn the mic over to you, Dr. Putu.
Thank you so much, James. It's so lovely to be here. And I hope you are safe and everyone is safe in DC and, of course, in Oxford and all over the world. It's quite late here in Indonesia. Again, so grateful for the invitation. And I've been looking at the attendance list, and there are some colleagues from Indonesia, particularly from Statistics Indonesia, who are also here. Thank you so much for joining us tonight in Indonesia. So this is very preliminary work. So we need a lot of input on this work. It was presented a couple of months ago in Italy, and I got a lot of feedback. So I'm very open to even more feedback today. So just to kind of give everyone an overview of what we'll be doing today, the first aim is to examine a new proposed index, which currently in this paper we call a Multidimensional Wellbeing Index, or a MUI for Indonesia. But before that, Indonesia has started to build a moderate MPI measure 2, and then we also have the consumption poverty measure. So the first aim of this paper is to examine a trial MWI index, particularly based on gross national happiness indicators and Indonesia's own happiness survey. Because we have data on moderate multidimensional poverty and also consumption poverty, the paper also compares across different measures and sees whether they are overlaps. And then the last, but not least, aim is to explore possible policy applications in the context of Indonesia. Just a little bit of an overview of Indonesia's story towards recognizing multidimensional poverty, or the multidimensional nature of poverty. So Indonesia actually has always recognized poverty as a multidimensional phenomena. Our social protection policies are also multidimensional, actually tackling different aspects of poverty in different through different tools. So family welfare, education-related policies, food and nutrition-related policies, but we currently still measure officially using consumption, so that's our official poverty statistics. But in 2022, Statistics Indonesia started trialing, and I think BPS or Statistics Indonesia colleagues here could maybe share a little bit more on this. Internally, trial measures of multidimensional poverty. And in 2023 and 2024, up until 2025, the Ministry of Finance trialed a moderate MPI index. We first tried to replicate global MPI indicators using our national socioeconomic survey, but deprivation rates are relatively low for acute multidimensional poverty. So the Ministry of Finance developed a moderate MPI measure through participatory dialogues, and this measure was incorporated within the official Ministry of Finance planning documents called the KMPPKF. Actually, our president just presented the Ministry of Finance planning documents a couple of days ago. And then, excitingly, the government, through our national development plans, RPJMN 2025-2029, has ratified the need for a farmer well-being index, so for a MWI specifically for farming households, and been grateful enough to be included within the discussions of this measure by Statistics Indonesia, and there are plans to refield the survey in 2026 because the indicator is now an official indicator within Indonesia's national planning documents. So again, growing recognition that consumption alone is not sufficient to pinpoint issues of poverty. So there's a move towards multidimensional poverty in Indonesia and also well-being. This is just a little bit of a background with regards to why multidimensionality and also well-being is important. So we recognize 5 tenets, and I was just telling Maya that we have a bank holiday on Monday to celebrate Pancasila. The second tenet is on social justice for all. So development should be understood as justice and collective dignity. And tomorrow it's Idul Adha or Eid. It's the pinnacle of Islamic social values or zakat, which also recognizes the balance of individual and community, and also of multidimensional vulnerability and livelihoods. Also in other faiths and I guess religions and points of views in Indonesia, so Catholic social teachings on development must develop the human person as a whole, and also local beliefs on harmony between relationships between humans themselves, nature, and with a concept of the divine. So this idea of multidimensional well-being has been ingrained within Indonesia's social culture, and now it's an actual indicator, but particularly for farming households within our national development plans. So this is just an overview of what I will do. So I'm trialing the Multidimensional Wellbeing Index based on a national happiness survey. The moderate MPI is based on analysis of the nationals, a different national survey, but also choice of indicators were based on focus group discussions with national and local government representatives. So for the moderate MPI, I'm using the National Socioeconomic Survey, which also has a consumption module. But for the Multidimensional Wellbeing Index, I'm using the the National Happiness Survey, or in Indonesia, it's called SPTK. The years that overlap were 2021, so the latest, most recent SPTK is 2021. So I'm using 2021 data, and these are just little snippets of the FGDs and field visits that, and also the KMPPKF documents that the Ministry of Finance conducted and published on the moderate MPI. And this is just a little bit of an overview of the components of the moderate MPI, very similar to the global MPI, only with more stringent cutoffs and have added an indicator or a dimension on employment. And so focusing on multidimensional well-being, again, it's a trial measure, so it's not a final measure. It still needs to go through several tests and robustness checks. And also I received a lot of input on weight, so whether, and also a lot of questions from Statistic Indonesia also, and from Indonesia has a statistical community forum or Forum Masyarakat Statistics that have asked a lot of questions on how to weight subjective versus objective indicators, whether we should give them a lower weight or how to include them within the index. And it would be great to have, of course, your input in the audience, James, Sabina, Claudia, and Maya, and everyone in the audience too. So this trial measure was modeled on the gross national happiness measure from Bhutan. It includes 8 domains similar to the gross national happiness index, only that the SPTK data set doesn't have a specific indicator on culture. So I've had to drop one domain from the JNH representing culture, but it has indicators of psychological well-being, health, time use, education, both objective and subjective indicators for education, and also time use. And community cohesion, that's subjective indicators, good governance, subjective indicators, environment, quality of environment, and living standards, which also has objective and subjective indicators. And here's a more detailed breakdown of the indicators. Again, this is a trial measure, so very far from final. So the first psychological well-being indicator is life satisfaction. Actually, Statistics Indonesia, when they were reporting results from SPTK, used this life satisfaction measure as like a headline indicator, so a single headline indicator. It's binary, so do you feel fulfilled? Yes or no? And then positive emotions, the survey measures a couple of different indicators, but I've tried to sort of match those that are that were used in the gross national happiness domain list or indicator list. So the feeling of usefulness, optimism about the future, ability to cope with current situations, and are you happy with your current condition? It's measured in Likert scale. And so the BPS or Statistics Indonesia for the life satisfaction indicator uses you are satisfied if you choose a scale of 6 and above. So I've used that sort of logic, although using this cutoff has led to high levels of fulfillment in positive emotions. So I had input on whether to actually maybe increase the stringency of the cutoff and trial that. And then the next indicator for psychological well-being is negative emotions. So it's a binary yes, no of whether you experience these conditions. So tiredness of life, disappointment, being afraid, not confident, worried, and feeling that you have been treated unfairly. Recall period is all at the current moment. And these questions are asked of individuals within the household aged 15 and above. And then we have the health domain. So the health domain has health complaints and daily activities. And it's also Likert scale, categories 1 to 4, from never experienced to very often. And in this case, I've just used the most sort of stringent cutoff, so never experienced, which of course is open to debate. And then the next indicator is subjective health. So are you satisfied with your health condition and satisfied if you chose 6 or above? And then education, interestingly, has both objective and subjective indicators. So years of schooling is very similar to the global MPI years of schooling. So high school certificate level. And in Indonesia, because 9 years of education is compulsory, although some provinces have started, and also, of course, the national planning documents have targeted for 12 years. But in this case, because the regulations is still 9 years of compulsory education, so I've used that cutoff. But the subjective view is, again, Likert scale, how satisfied are you with the current situation of your education and skills that you have? And then we have time use. So interestingly, in the SPTK, there are questions on leisure time and work time. So in this case, I've just tried to use sort of a crude measure of figuring out how much leisure time an individual has within the week. And I've used the ILO sort of work, not overworked standard hours per week and per day, and crudely sort of set a cutoff of if you need a minimum of 21 hours per week of leisure, so that's 3 hours per day. It might be sort of too little, but of course open to debate. And then there's also an indicator asking people whether they are satisfied with the leisure time and the use of their leisure time. Again, like at scale 1 to 10. And then work time is also subjective, so it's not overworked basically for this indicator. And then interestingly, the survey has indicators on community cohesion. So whether you are able to contribute to your community through donations, and that's something really important, particularly within the Indonesian community. So zakat, again, Islamic values on zakat is very important. So the cutoff is sufficient if you are able to donate rather than not at all. And then there are indicators of family harmony and also safety and trust in neighbors. Also, good governance, again, interesting. So so trust in government, the survey is pretty detailed. So it sort of asks people whether they trust government officials from sort of the village level up to the national level. And also trust in elections, so political processes. For environment, which is something very important for Indonesia, we have a lot of adverse effects of climate change and natural disasters. So for this, the survey has an indicator on natural disaster experience. Again, I chose the most stringent cutoff of never experiencing. And then it also has a subjective indicator on how people view the environment in which they live, whether they feel satisfied in their living environment or not. And then we have a domain for living standards. Housing and assets are objective, very similar to the global MPI criteria, adequate housing and assets. And there's also a subjective view of living conditions, so whether you're satisfied with your living conditions. So those are the very preliminary domains and indicators, very open to a lot of input. And again, for this preliminary measure, I've chose a K cutoff of 66%. Of course, robustness checks need to be done to look at sensitivity to K cutoffs. With this K cutoff and with those configuration of indicators and with equal nested weights, so I haven't weighted subjective indicators differently from objective indicators. The head count of people having the necessary aspects of to be in well-being. So I had a lot of questions from Statistics Indonesia also on how to interpret MWI numbers and how to communicate them with policymakers and how to align them with policy action. So with that configuration, we find that about 81% of individuals will have the necessary aspects to be in well-being. And not yet in well-being, about sort of 19%. And for those who are sufficient, they experience sufficiency in about 80% of the indicators. So they still experience insufficiency in about 20% of them. For those who are not yet in well-being, they experience a sufficiency level of about 57%. So those who are sufficient seem to do well in education, leisure, assets, and trust in institutions. But those who are not yet sufficient seem to do well in relational and emotional buffers. So family harmony, safety, and elements of emotional well-being, It could be sort of an indicator of social resilience, particularly in developing countries and the importance of community cohesion. But of course, that needs to be tested more. But the important thing is that well-being is composed of overlapping domains, and joint experiences then matter, and hence the importance of the counting method. And these are raw sufficiency headcounts, as you see, particularly for community cohesion and some aspects, some subjective aspects. A lot of them are sort of like over 90% sufficient. So hence the consideration of maybe increasing the stringency of the sufficiency cutoffs. So as in a nutshell, emotional asymmetry seems to be evident. So positive emotions are reported by almost everyone, but the complete absence of negative emotions is still rare. So only about 7% of individuals report complete absence of negative emotions. And point two is quite important because Statistics Indonesia then reported general results from SPTK through the life satisfaction indicator as a headline indicator. But life satisfaction itself is much lower than the experience of positive emotions. So there could be a distinction between experience effects, so how people feel in the moment, and how they evaluate their well-being overall. So correlation between life satisfaction and overall, well, multidimensional well-being is moderate. So the I guess main message is that well-being now can't be reduced into a single indicator, and hence the great effort of Statistics Indonesia now to create a multidimensional well-being framework to describe household well-being for farming households. Social cohesion seemed to be the strongest domain. So family harmony and trust in neighbors seem to be really high. So I should consider to probably revise the cutoff. Education, subjective and objective housing indicators remain challenging, basically from SPTK 2021. And here are sort of disaggregation of sufficiency levels across different characteristics. So divided by urban and rural. So urban residents seem to report higher sufficiency compared to rural residents. There might be urban advantage related to access to services, but again, need to be tested. Sufficiency rates are sort of identical for men and women, although slightly higher than men. I would need to do statistical significance tests to see if this is statistically significant. If we divide and disaggregate by age, it seems that older individuals have lesser levels of sufficiency, possibly indicating vulnerability in older age. And Indonesia now is trying to move policy towards care economies, particularly in urban areas. Married individuals report highest levels of sufficiency, and then it gets lower for divorced and widowed individuals. Again, importance of companionship and social relations. Interesting when we look at household size, single person households report lower levels of sufficiency, and it sort of peaks with households 3 to 4 members and slightly declines with large households. And looking at income, so SPTK doesn't have sort of quantitative, it has ranges of income. So idea 7.2 million. Currently, the rupiah exchange rate is tanking against the dollar by day. So yeah, yeah, I can't convert this on the top of my head, but basically, people in the higher sort of like income groups report higher sufficiency levels than those who are in lower income groups. This is something also really interesting, particularly there have been, of course, debates on the adequacy and use and robustness of subjective well-being indicators. So we looked at I'm just looking at my timer. I think I still have a little bit of time. We looked at thanks, James. Intercorrelations. So basically, do individuals that report high levels of subjective well-being also do well in objective living conditions? So we looked at correlations between objective and subjective indicators. So if correlations are weak, it could suggest that subjective well-being is only partially determined by objective living conditions, or it could reflect adaptation or resilience or social buffering or deferring expectations. And then we also looked at intra-correlations. So do subjective items correlate strongly with each other? If they correlate strongly, it could sort of indicate some sort of stable disposition, or it could mean that all the subjective indicators represent one underlying sort of latent disposition, or some sort of general happiness tendency, or an indicator of personality. So if moderate, this would probably instead support the interpretation that subjective well-being domains are related, but yet substantively distinct, and hence should be measured multidimensionally. And these are the correlations in a nutshell. It seems that subjective well-being indicators don't really correlate with objective living conditions. For intra-correlations, it seems that subjective indicators correlate more strongly with each other compared to between subjective and objective. So it could point to shared evaluative tendencies, more stable dispositions, but they're not excessively high. So they're not sort of like really high correlation scores. So it would indicate that subjective domains are related, but they still remain meaningfully distinctive. So supporting the idea of having a multidimensional well-being framework. And another important point was that life satisfaction aligns more closely with subjective perceptions rather than objective living conditions. So, and this I found also interesting, looking at correlations between the different measures. So multidimensional well-being, and then moderate multidimensional poverty and consumption poverty headcounts across the Indonesia's districts. So Indonesia has 547 districts, which have probably increased to 568. I need to check. So there's a sort of moderate negative link between MWI and the moderate multidimensional poverty headcount, and also moderate negative link between MWI and consumption poverty. And consumption poverty and moderate MPI are also moderately correlated. So again, subjective well-being does not mirror poverty one-to-one. Moderate multidimensional poverty also assesses something a bit deeper. So consumption also needs to be complemented by moderate multidimensional poverty. This is looking at the measures across provinces now currently. So it seems that monetary poverty and moderate MPI seem to overlap more, but of course not perfectly. Subjective well-being insufficiency patterns also don't fully mirror monetary poverty patterns and moderate MPI patterns. Some provinces have relatively high consumption and moderate MPI poverty, but don't have high levels of perceived insufficiency. But also there are, particularly in Eastern Indonesia, provinces that have relatively high levels of moderate MPI, high consumption poverty, and also low sufficiency levels. So indicating cumulative disadvantages that the government urgently needs to address. But importantly, the three measures seem to capture different layers of welfare, and hence the importance of looking at all measures. So this is my concluding slide, and I've used Sabina's parable of the minions with different eyes, and hence different lenses to look at poverty and well-being. So the three measures seem to capture different layers of welfare. subjective well-being only sort of is weakly sort of related to objective conditions. Social context matters when we look at the disaggregations. So for policy messages, I'm hoping that these results will push towards not only quantity of types of policies, but also the level of service that, and also how those policies meet people's needs. So not only sort of bulk and quantity, but also starting to look at experience, service, and policy quality. Quality, trust, and dignity really matters. So this needs to be strengthened, particularly in Indonesia's current political condition. Fairness is something very important in policy delivery. Social buffering mechanisms seem to be very, very important when we look at SPTK results, and that is rapidly changing in an urbanized Indonesia. So the government does need to think about the role of care economies as social structures start to change in Indonesia. And of course, really important, monitoring should adopt these multiple lenses. So relying only on consumption poverty may underestimate lived welfare gaps. So I think I'm going to stop there. And James, and give it back to you and open to input and questions.
Thank you so much, Putu. That was just, well, it was a wonderful compendium for your country. The people there should be very appreciative of the kinds of research that you continue to do. I'm going to open the floor to folks, first of all, in the audience, but I thought I'd see if Sabina had anything that had just jumped into her mind. If not, I'll jump in. So you you tell me, Sabina. Me jump or
I've
you
got
jump?
lost, but I don't want to take too much time. So tell me what to do.
You got lost?
No, I
You're-
have lots of comments
oh,
and
yes,
suggestions and
yes. Well,
questions.
then you go first.
Okay. Um, so I'll sort of batch them into responding to Putu's questions, some methodological suggestions, and some queries. So one question you had, Putu, which is a very valid one, is whether to have equal weights for subjective and objective questions. And as you know, in Bhutan, the decision was made to have one domain that was entirely subjective, i.e. psychological well-being. And in the other domains where there were subjective questions, to give them a light weight of 1/10 or so of the dimensional weight. And the reason that was done was that there was concern about interpreting the trends over time. Because if the frame of reference shifts, then you might have an objective indicator moving in a positive direction, but all of a sudden the frame of reference has shifted, so the subjective question could move in the opposite direction. We did that in theory, but in both of the updates of the GNH for Bhutan, it has happened in practice. One indicator that exemplifies this is perceptions of government performance. Bhutan had come to democracy in 2008, and in 2010, everybody was in love and thought government performance and their perceptions was top. It was nearly above 90%. And 5 years into the marriage with democracy, it had fallen by 46% of the population. So if that had been equally weighted, it would have led to a very different change in results. But was this due to actual changes, or were the initial perceptions unrealistic? It's a valid question. Another example is subjective health. So in contexts where there's a shared understanding of good health in rural and urban areas by educated and uneducated populations, the frame of reference may not shift. But with the penetration of technology, with videos of people with different body types and teeth coming in Bhutan at least, there was a shift. So the number of healthy days, the objective health indicators improved, and the subjective health indicators, subjective assessment of health decreased. So for that reason, it might be interesting to have lighter weights on subjective questions, or to group them into a subjective assessment kind of domain alongside psychological well-being as a ninth domain. Then I have a number of queries where you use correlation and might be able to also use a different methodology. You correlate life satisfaction, which goes from 0 to 10, I believe, with the MWI. In the case of Bhutan, they did a crosstab using 7 as the dividing point for the life satisfaction data, following, I believe, the World Happiness Report cutoff at the time. And they found that half of the people who were happy by the GNH index had happiness by that subjective well-being cutoff, and half did not. So again, it's a powerful result, a different way of communicating. Another time you use the correlation is across indicators. And correlation for indicators where 90% of the population and higher have sufficiency is, as you know, affected by all boxes. And so it might be better to do something like a redundancy analysis, or to complement correlation with a redundancy that's less affected by the value of the sufficiency in each indicator. And a similar issue is with the income quintiles. Income quintiles, you can just crosstab what proportion of the highest income quintile enjoyed well-being, MWI, and what proportion did not, because this is a dichotomous indicator. And that's actually, again, a very easy way to communicate to non-experts the fact that income and well-being hold hands, but they don't walk arm in arm. They're quite distinct. And this was reported, for example, in the most recent GNH index for Bhutan. Then some other questions. You discussed whether to adjust the subjective well-being cutoff. You could mechanically, as a robustness test to the deprivation cutoff thresholds, adjust it up to 7, which is, as I think, a standard in some of the subjective well-being indicator, or at a starting level to a certain population. The policy reason is that if everybody has 90+%, there's not much room for government to improve. And maybe that is the case, that social relations are really at an all-time high, and the only way to go is down. But if you think there might be space to improve, then that would be an argument normatively to adjust the cutoffs, perhaps from 6 to 7, 24 to 28 in the negative and positive emotions, etc. Also, having 0 for the negative emotions is very stringent. I would love to meet a person who never had any negative emotions, but it might be that some muted level of negative emotions was permitted. And then some different small points. The population shares of the disaggregated units could be put on the graphs. I'm sure you have them in the paper, but that just helps us to understand the population shares of who you're comparing. And then what I didn't understand in the maps is if the MWI was negative or positive, if the colors were working in the same way or the opposite way to the MPI and consumption poverty. So I spent all my time trying to work out the direction of the coloring. But one easy way to do that would be to color in red the least well off, and in some other color that permits colorblind people to see it, the best 10 districts or provinces. And so you can see at a glance if they are the same in terms of pattern or different. So that might be one way. And then the final question, just about, you have so many results. And again, the question is how to present them in your 547 units. Again, you could batch them rather than doing a correlation, or in addition to doing a correlation, you could say, you know, we are in the lowest 100, the middle or the highest, or have some segment into 3 or 4 or 5 groups, and then see who's low in all or in the middle or etc. See the mismatch between groups, because correlation hides falls up and down. You don't know if they're clustered in the bottom, but they disagree at the top, or how exactly it is. And so some other way, a three-way diagram might add a lot of value, because there's so much information in what you have. And as you said, they need some standard errors, especially at the lowest level. But there's still a lot, I think, we can learn from the empirical results. So I'm sorry I've gone on so long, but it's only because you got me so interested in all of the details that you've presented and hungry to hear more. So thank you so much.
How about a response to any of them?
Thank you, James, and thank you so much, Sabina. Of course, all important points. I'll start trialing the different weights. Sabina, a good point on learning from the GNH structure. Actually, I know that there are Statistics Indonesia colleagues in the audience, and I think all your points are relevant also for colleagues currently developing the farming household well-being measure. Also on correlations and using redundancy and cross tabulations, and also on the cutoffs and yeah, well, it's good to know to be permitted to have some negative emotions. Yeah, and then population shares on graphs and on the maps. Yes, the colors go the same way, but thank you so much, Sabina, for pointing out how to present them in a more inclusive and easier to understand way. And also on your point on the on looking at batches, I think you do that with Lachi in your work with the Gallup survey. So thank you so much for your input. Yeah, all very relevant points.
Right. So I asked the virtual audience to put their questions into the chat or to the Q&A. Let's see, I have my own question to you, which was very simple. It is that it's well known that there is a unusually high level of satisfaction or happiness in Indonesia. And as a result, I want to emphasize the point I think that Sabina was making, that there are potentially, I mean, I won't say issues. It's a wonderful thing that people are absolutely beaming in Indonesia, and yet the level of income may be at a level that's far lower than other countries that are at that level of happiness. The question for me really was if you might, first of all, it'll impact how you construct your indices, but also if you might suss out a little bit of that, which we as development economists are really quite interested in seeing or getting a little bit more in depth on what people are experiencing and how it relates to what it is that they feel. So when I say that, I mean over time, as Sabina was pointing out, over time there may be a shift in the subjective well-being that's caused by a variety of things, perhaps totally unrelated to any policy of the government or any actions taken on the objective side. Very, very interesting to see how things change through time, and also how relations between variables change through time, but also across space. You pointed out the eastern portion was having trouble in all dimensions, in a sense, in all three measures, but maybe others are not. And therefore, the interest to me would be, to what extent do we see and can tease out what's really in the minds of people as they see their world around them, with many objective hardships and subjective positivities and lower negativities. So I'm quite interested in that. If you ever have a chance to dig into that a little bit more, that would be grand. But otherwise, tell me, maybe I get a graduate student on it here. But all right. So other questions for people out there? I see that it's simply the folks in OFI saying, put your questions in the chat.
James, thank you for that. Actually, I have 3 waves of SPTK. So I could technically do that. So it's not a panel data set, it's a cross-sectional data set, but I have 2014, 2017, and 2021. So technically I could look at relations between indicators over time, looking at over time. I'm actually also hoping to go in. I've been talking to Sabina about this to do ground truthing or so measuring first and then trying to figure out what is basically happening. So we have consumption, we have moderate multidimensional poverty, and now we have a well-being indicator to see what is happening on the ground. So hopefully, I could go and travel with the Statistics Indonesia team to look at to explore that in more detail, James. And of course, it would be great to have your guidance on next steps on that.
Very interesting. Well, let's see if Sabina has one or two more, because I don't see that the audience is activated. Audience, please be activated. Sabina.
I just noticed that you didn't have anything in the cultural domain. And I know that when there was the workshop on well-being in February, that there was a lot of interest also in the spiritual aspects of life. And so whether it's ground truthing or talking with other colleagues in BBS, it would be interesting to figure out what are the appropriate ways of measuring these maybe in the future, because it does seem that across the world, across different approaches to a greater than human source of meaning and value, the vast majority of people on the planet have that as part of their worldview. We're on the eve of Eid. And so I think that trying to think of how to recognize that as a potential source of well-being, indeed of profound well-being, and also a font of other practices, whether it's subjective states or actions like giving zakat, would be very useful. So I think, like when we write poverty papers, we say we would want to include empowerment, but the indicators are not in the data sets. I think continuing to name aspects of well-being that come up in qualitative or participatory interactions with communities that we cannot yet measure is a good way of keeping this on the agenda. And I think the last thing that would be interesting for this group is also for feedback on the methodology and the ways that this could add value in terms of a tool where you would be able to then look at the shortfalls. And if you read the MWI for Indonesia that you've created, the areas of government priority are things like negative emotions, education. And I think it would be another question for you in terms of indicator development to try to read what seem to be the well-being shortfalls from public discussions, as it were, and see if the measure is true to those, or if it might be, again, a measurement fiat that you could correct by changing deprivation cutoffs or sufficiency cutoffs. And Leonardo does have a question. So I'm done.
Great. Well, a question I'd like to know, how often will this be published? That's what Leonardo says. Putu?
Thank you, Sabina, and thank you, James, and thank you, Leonardo. Well, this measure is a trial. It's a trial measure, so it's academic currently. So the measure I've computed is academic, but in the RPJMN, so in the National Development Plan documents, the government targets like yearly improvements. So so it's monitored across the RPJMN so development planning document period, and hopefully it extends to further planning documents. So I don't know, but this measure is purely academic, the one that I have just presented. Thank you, though, Leonardo, for your question.
Fantastic. Well, just to mention it, I should mention that I've had a student studying the non-material aspects of poverty and well-being for quite a while, a PhD student who also is a top-notch development economist. So it might be nice to put him in touch just to see the overlap. He's from India. Until then, any other questions? How about at Oxford? Anyone in the audience who has their hands up or down?
Oh, okay. Hi, James. I'm Erna, and I'm a student at Oxford University Said Business School. Currently, I'm participating in a global competition called Map the Systems, and I'm part of a team that will be competing at the final competition in July. And our team's researching on the high churn rate from primary school to junior secondary school. And we've been looking at the statistic data from the Statistic Indonesia website, and we're trying to like combine all different reasons why there is a high churn rate in that schooling sector. And we see that there are different reasons, for example, like poverty, health, governance, funding issues, and so forth, are all intertwined together. And in terms of the contribution of education to the well-being of Indonesia, to the Indonesian public or people, it might not be it's not a really question about the methodology of your research, but if you have any insight regarding the impact of education on the well-being of Indonesia and what you think that needs to improve in the future, that would be very interesting to hear.
Thank you so much. Thank you also for basing your work on Indonesia, and yes, we have huge challenges with upwards mobility with regards to access to education. So primary access, well, again, it's huge levels of inequality across Western and Eastern Indonesia, but seems to be okay. So 70 to 90% attendance. And secondary, it sort of drops to 75%. And then high school, it really significantly drops. University, even more significant drops. So a lot of challenges. Whether it be infrastructure and education quality. If you look at Indonesia's PISA scores, we have declined. So Indonesia also has our own PISA scoring system called INBK. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at that. The Ministry of Education also has it's called Pusat Data, Pusdatin for Ministry of Education. They also have quite a comprehensive database that you can access freely. So the ministry has something called raport pendidikan or educational report, like a school report at each province, even at each district. So if you look at the Ministry of Education website, your question was on why the role of education. When we look at the MWI, education plays a big role and contribution to people feeling people in the condition of not being sufficient in well-being. So particularly the objective years of schooling indicators. Reasons behind that: infrastructure, still access to infrastructure. Even though education up until primary level is free for all, the government also has something called Program Indonesia Pintar or Indonesia Smart Program, the top-ups for non-tuition based fees. It also has something called Bantuan Operasional Sekolah or school operational support to support um, infrastructure and sort of teachers, but still not enough. Also an issue of educational quality. So our own PISA dataset also has indicators on teacher sort of pedagogic quality. You can access it freely, only that you can't disaggregate it per sort of district, because the government doesn't want us to compare across districts, basically. I don't know if that's helpful, but if you need more help, you're welcome to get in touch.
Thank you very
Thank you,
much,
though.
guys. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, we're nearing the end of our time here. I do want to point out that in the Q&A, Leonardo has come back to mention that in Brazil, there's a socioeconomic performance index that has similarities and some differences. So you may want to have a look at that. I think he's put his email address there for connecting directly. So we will have that email address available. Finally, we have an anonymous attendee. Thank you so much for your research. As an Indonesian, I'm curious whether there might be some correlations between the high school cohesion results with positive emotions, considering there might be social pressure to appear happy. Just a brief response on that. What do you think about that? Putu?
Thank you, James, and thank you so much for the question. So the subjective indicators tend to correlate higher between them compared to subjective and objective, of course, but it's still sort of a crude measure. There's no sort of like, I guess, definite answer to your question. I would need more research and further research to figure out whether societal pressures to appear happy is actually driving these results. And again, I guess ground truthing and talking to people, as James said, would be something very important, I guess, in that step. But yeah, again, I'm also very interested in this as James and as you are. So but thank you for that.
Well, on that note, let's bring our session today to a close. Remember, there'll be another one around the same time next week. I know I'll be somewhere different, and I bet Sabina will, and perhaps a number of us will. So until then, take care, stay healthy.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone. Happy
Bye now.
Eid for those
Oh,
celebrating.
yes.
Take care, everyone. Thank you so much.